25 October, 1944 dawn, rain off Samar in the Philippines. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's escort carriers Gambia Bay Street, low white plains Kalinin Bay, Fanshawe Bay, Kitkun Bay, run a ragged line behind a growing wall of smoke, while destroyer Johnston under Commander Ernest Evans punches out of the grey at flank speed. 5-inch guns snap to continuous fire tracers, stitch a cruiser's bridge, and the torpedo officer shouts the count. Tubes slam, wakes flare white, and a spread races toward the bows of heavy cruiser Kumano. Japanese salvos from battleships, Yamato, Nagato, Kongō, and Haruna, straddle so close the deck plates ring. Spray smashes the bridge windows. Shards clatter across the forecastle like gravel in a steel drum. The first blast lifts a geyser off a bow, the second silences a turret, and the third tears open a shoulder of armour that had looked invincible from the carrier's decks. Hoel under Commander Leon Kintberger heaves out of the smoke and turns straight in shells, already walking across the superstructure of a cruiser that had been ranging the jeep carriers. Heermann under Commander Amos Hathaway cuts across the grain of the swells with a bone in her teeth, splashes towering to mast height on either beam, helm jammed hard over to comb lines of incoming fire while her own torpedoes slip free, slide for the enemy's belly. On the carrier decks behind plane handlers shove Wildcats and Avengers to the cat lines as fast as the deck crews can clear them. Anything with wings roars off into the squalls, some carrying only machine guns, some with depth charges dragged forward to serve as instant bombs. Across the Japanese line under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, range clocks spin and the director teams fight the smoke. Yahagi's signal halyards snap, flags whip wet, and the order to turn out ripples down a column that a minute earlier had looked like a sledge moving toward eggshells. A voice on Johnston's TBS is steady and dry commence, making smoke open fire as you bear. Another beat, and Samuel B. Roberts, under Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, sprints from cover, 5-inch mounts, chattering like a factory line, closing to a range where men can see faces through binocular glass between sheets of rain. By the third week of October, 1944, the late landings are underway, and every hour of flying cover over the beaches depends on 6 slow escort carriers strung out off Samar. 7th Fleet, under Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, has its heavy surface strength guarding other approaches, which leaves Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague with a thin skin of steel around flight decks packed with Avengers and Wildcats. The morning report says the main Japanese surface threat was beaten back in the Sibuyan Sea the day before. The sea says otherwise. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita has forced San Bernardino Strait in the dark, and now his center force battleships, Yamato, Nagato, Kongō, Haruna, with heavy cruisers and a destroyer screen stands up out of the rain already ranging. Everything that follows rides on minutes. If that column holds its line and pushes through the smoke, heavy shells will fall on carrier hulls before the next deck cycle can launch. If the carriers are cracked open, the air umbrella over the Leyte beachhead thins ground forces lose close support, and the timetable for securing the Gulf drags into blood and fuel. The Japanese stake their morning on gunnery range and armoured mass. Big guns erase small hulls, and small hulls are all that stand in front of them. The American answer is not wait, but procedure. Generate smoke, force the enemy to change course, blind his directors with 5-inch at superstructure height, and put torpedoes in the water at angles that make a battle line. Think about survival instead of killing. On the U.S. side, the order of battle is lean and specific. Taffy 3 carries Gambia Bay Street, low white plains, Kalinin Bay, Fanshawe Bay, and Kitkun Bay, each with modest air groups built to guard soldiers ashore. The screen is 3 destroyers: Johnston under Commander Ernest Evans, Hoel under Commander Leon Kintberger, Heermann under Commander Amos Hathaway, and 4 destroyer escorts led into the weather by Samuel B. Roberts under Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland. No fast battleships, no heavy cruisers, and no time to wait for help. Sprague needs space more than he needs kills, and space comes from forcing the enemy to turn. On the Japanese side, the logic is equally clear. The last intact battleships in the theatre are present with veteran cruiser divisions that know how to walk salvos onto a target with optical directors. If they can get clean lines of sight and keep ladder correction steady, A carrier will die in daylight, and the invasion's rhythm will break. Kurita must move fast. Fuel is tight, air cover thin, and every mile run under American aircraft after sunrise is a mile risked. The quickest solution is to smash the flimsy guard and put the big guns into the carriers before strikes can stack high enough to matter. The two beliefs meet at the edge of a rain squall. Americans believe smoke buys. Time-violent maneuver ruins the enemy's range. Clocks and torpedoes are formation weapons that bend even a battleship. Japanese officers believe heavy shells and armor settle any small ship argument, and that the escort carriers will not live long if the screen hesitates. Neither side is wrong in theory. The difference is tempo. The carriers are already turning into the wind deck crews, sliding chocks and pushing aircraft to the cat lines, while the destroyers lift out of their wakes and angle in. The range is closing, and the only way to hold the beachheads air is to make the battleships think about wakes instead of flight decks. Morale is balanced on opposite edges. Japanese crews retain a hard confidence in the names on their order book and the reach of their rifles, even as fuel and training hours have thinned since the first year of the war. American crews are tired and outgunned in metal, but they are drilled in habits that do not ask permission. Helm orders are short smoke generators coughed to life, and fire control talks in sight pictures rather than hope. When Evans pushes Johnston to flank speed and swings out of the smoke, he is not chasing glory. He is applying the only geometry that gives the carriers behind him a chance to keep launching. The stakes are not abstract. If the line breaks straight through, splashes will walk across flight decks before the next cycle can lift. Aircraft will go over the side with their wings folded, and the Leyte beaches will feel the absence within the hour. If the American charge forces' successive turns, range will open, and salvos will go blind in a white wall. The carriers will keep throwing metal into the weather, and every pass, bombs, guns, even depth charges thrown as improvised bombs, will chip speed and concentration from the column that looked like a sledge a few minutes earlier. The window stays tight by design. No one here is relitigating 1942. The only calendar entry that matters is this morning off Samar. Procedure must beat myth before 9 o'clock, or the day tilts the wrong way. The question that pulls the narrative forward is simple and final: can tiny ships make capital ships turn long enough for flight decks to decide the rest? The Japanese line is built to erase anything smaller than a cruiser. Yamato and Nagato throw shells that travel farther than any American 5-inch can answer, and the cruiser divisions are practiced at walking salvos until thin skins split, in clear light and steady sea that math holds. Off Samar, the math bends. Rain arrives in ragged curtains, and American smoke turns a horizon into a chalkboard wiped mid-equation. Optical directors need consistent splashes to trim the ladder. When the target vanishes into white and grey, the corrections drift. A column that looked like a straight punch begins to sketch curves as helm orders multiply. What the escorts aim to do is not trade metal, they aim to cut nerves. 5-inch high explosive, bursting around director towers and bridges, is worth more than a perfect belt hit. A blinded cruiser is a heavy hull forced to guess, and guessing in rain invites more mistakes. Johnston, under Commander Ernest Evans, shows how the geometry works. She breaks from the veil at speed guns, already stitching a cruiser's topside. The torpedo officer sets the last gyro angle, and a spread slashes forward. Moments later, Kumano's bow is blown open, speed falls off, and a gun line disappears from the problem. That single distortion of the Japanese picture forces others to adjust bearings and time their salvos all over again. The second half of the toolkit is helm violence. At ranges under 12,000 yards, a destroyer does not survive by armor, it survives by ruining the enemy's rate solution. Zigs that comb incoming salvos change the relative motion enough that a straddle becomes a string of near misses. Every time a Japanese ship receives a torpedo alarm and swings out, watchers on the carriers can see the line kink. Heermann, under Commander Amos Hathaway, uses the kinks. She knifes across, splashes high as a house, releases her own fish, and pulls fire off the jeep carriers behind the smoke. The act of turning to avoid those wakes breaks concentration along the column. Guns that might have settled on a flat-topped hull instead track a destroyer sliding out of frame. Air matters even when loads are thin. The escort carriers have few armor-piercing bombs, but they have pilots and ordnance that can still hurt mobility. Wildcats rake bridges and decks to silence lookouts and signal lines. Avengers come down through the gaps in the weather with general-purpose bombs and even depth charges rigged as improvised bombs when racks run short. A hit that chews piping or jams a rudder matters more than a clean circle on a diagram. In the minutes after Gambia Bay is lost to cruiser fire, those same cruisers take repeated blows that start fires and drag their speed down. Chikuma will not make it out. Destroyer escorts show the same logic in a smaller frame. Samuel B. Roberts under Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland sprints out of cover and drives her 5-inch as if it were a factory line, rounds arriving so fast that Japanese spotters cannot count between bursts. At knife range, 100 pounds of high explosive at a time into directors, rangefinders and gun crews does the real work. A cruiser can carry its armour to the end of the ocean. It cannot carry sight when the eyes are gone. In these moments, the tactical language becomes physical. Range drums spin uselessly when splashes vanish. Chart tables slide as a ship heels into a torpedo avoidance turn, and voices on Japanese bridges flatten to clipped orders that admit uncertainty. Translate the numbers into what men feel. At 9 to 12,000 yards, 3 seconds separate survival from a straddle. A destroyer that gets smoke up first and starts the first zig buys those seconds. A 5-inch burst that tears canvas and glass from a director removes the last piece of certainty. Once the eyes are blindfolded, even a well-drilled cruiser fires by habit rather than measurement, and habit is slow against a target that refuses to stay where math expects. The American weapons that matter are not listed on a brochure. They are the things that interrupt the enemy's process: smoke that forces a search, torpedoes that force a turn, gunfire that forces a blink. Each engagement echoes the last. Johnston's opening strike mutilates a bow and tears a hole in the morning's plan. Heermann's run multiplies evasive orders and buys minutes for another deck cycle. Samuel B. Roberts claws at superstructures until barrels fall quiet. Overhead, every pass from the carriers needles tempo away from the column that had intended to end the fight in a single advance. The shape of threat changes from a sledge into a set of separated blows, and separated blows are easier to answer. The destroyers do not make the battleships fragile, they make them indecisive. That is enough for the flight decks to decide the rest. Rain stripes the bridge, glass and the wipers thud like metronomes. On a Japanese heavy cruiser, the director crew leans into eyepieces, the range drum clicks, spotters call the first straddles, and the ship shudders as her own main battery unloads. Escort carriers are silhouettes for a breath. Then a white wall grows smoke boiling across the horizon and splashes vanish inside it. The gunnery officer tightens his voice, corrects deflection, readies the next ladder step. He expects the small ships to shear away and die behind their own curtain. A destroyer punches out of that curtain at an oblique angle, black wake biting mounts flashing fast. High explosive bursts flower against glass and canvas around the director. Men flinch as shards skip a voice below decks, coughs on powder and salt. A lookout loses the next splash, reports only smoke and rain, and then the torpedo alarm fires in every bone. Starboard turn hard. Charts slide. The deck heels and the ladder rails bite, palms slick with spray. On the voice, pipes bearings compress to numbers and cut off. Johnston comes out of the grey with Commander Ernest Evans steady on the TBS. Commence making smoke. Open fire as you bear. The torpedo officer calls his last gyro tweak over the racket. The tubes thunder and wakes flare white and purposeful. 5-inch crews work a rhythm that feels like a machine shop. Ram, slam, fire, eject shells, raking directors and open mounts, not belts. The deck plates sing under near misses and the bridge windows spit salt and grit. The helm throws to comb a string of incoming splashes. The ship's vibration changes as propeller wash snarls against a hard rudder, and the gun director calls shift to the next superstructure. Target director blinded shift left. Heermann under Commander Amos Hathaway rides a trough and lifts clean with a bone of foam at the bow. Standby fish. Right, full steady shoot. Torpedoes leave in sequence, and the ship shoulders into a turn that drags the fall of shot, with her splashes climbing to mast height on both beams, the keel twisting under boots ground into the non-skid. Secondary batteries on a battleship rip long white scars into the air. Heermann answers with her own 5-inch deliberate on sights, bashing at rangefinders and the thin square faces of signal bridges. The radio keeps its clipped grammar. Target burning, shift left, protect the carriers. On Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland gets the engine room's all-ahead emergency, and the tiny ship surges like a kicked dog. Gun crews build a conveyor out of mussel shells, up cases out, breech shut, fire breech open. Recoil thumps through ribs and hot brass rings on steel. The smell is cordite and wet paint, and a little steam from a ruptured line that a damage controlman clamps with a strip of canvas and a wrench jaw set around a cigarette that keeps going out in the rain. At knife range, the 5-inch hammers open mounts and rangefinders until hands wave in confusion behind ripped canvas and glass. Behind the screen, the flight decks are wet and alive. Plane handlers shoulder push FM2 Wildcats to the cat lines, chocks tossed, tie-downs, snatching and smacking the planks. Avengers trundle forward with bombs, and when racks run short, depth charges lashed as makeshift ordnance. Exhaust has a sharp taste that sits in the throat. The landing signal officer flashes paddles against a sky that is the color of lead, and the next aircraft goes with whatever it has. Radios from the screen ride the ether into the ready rooms, keep them turning. Back on a Japanese bridge, the cadence that began confident range deflection correction shortens into monosyllables. Lookouts report losing the splash, losing the target, seeing only smoke and a destroyer's bow wave, where they expected a fleeing stern. The helmsman waits for the next course, hand on the wheel, eyes on a compass card that lifts and swings as another order lands from the gunnery board. Torpedo alarm again. Port this time. The ship rolls into it, and the messenger slips on a wet ladder rung and hits a shin hard enough to swear, then keeps moving because the tubes must be checked and the ready-use lockers counted. On Johnston, the torpedo officer watches for the second track to cross and lets out the breath he did not notice he was holding, already calculating a new solution that the weather will mangle in the next minute. The gunnery crew shifts targets without being told. They saw the director face fold and know to walk fire down to the next set of eyes. Damage control finds a hot steam leak under a deck plate, chalk lines a boundary, and backs out to reset a hose. The navigator draws a fresh attack leg with a pencil that scratches hard because the deck never stops moving. Heermann feels the battleship's attention slide as her track and the threat of steel in the water force a turn. That moment is the space the carriers need, and Hathaway keeps the rudder over to continue dragging fire away from the flat tops. Voice comes clean in the headset. Target masked by smoke. Renew. The smoke generators cough and take again a dirty white bloom, swallowing the stern as the ship legs back toward cover to reset for another run. The Japanese director party swaps in a spare optic, lashes the shattered hood, and shifts a battery to local control because the central system can no longer guarantee a picture through the rain and debris. The gunnery officer lifts binoculars and steadies them with both hands against the rubber cups, finds not a retreating silhouette, but a destroyer's prow, lifting over a swell gun flashes bright in the wet air. He says nothing unnecessary. The order goes to the helm and the ship bends again, big and reluctant. Procedure continues under impact. That is the feeling that takes root on both sides. One crew discovering that the small ships will not back away, the other crew discovering that the next run is already being drawn, with wet pencil on a bucking board, while casings ring and the smoke wall grows. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague does not have time to convene a council. The order set is simple and violent. Make smoke early, turn the carriers into the wind, launch continuously, send the destroyers to attack with torpedoes, and keep 5-inch fire on directors and bridges. The tin can captains act on contact without waiting for permission. Ernest Evans on Johnston drives out of the Vale because escort doctrine says torpedoes break solutions. Leon Kintberger on Hoel and Amos Hathaway on Heermann fold their tracks across the enemy's fall of shot to pull the ladder off the carriers. Robert Copeland on Samuel B. Roberts builds a gun conveyor on his small deck and aims every burst at eyes and hands, not armor. What allows these orders to repeat is a system that runs under shock. Combat information centers fuse radar pips, visual bearings, and short radio verbs into a loop that feeds guns and tubes without drama. Identify. Acquire, fire, relocate. The escort carriers are factories with wet floors, Plane handlers push Wildcats and Avengers to the cat lines with whatever the crews can hang in minutes. Fighters go even when they have guns only. Avengers launch with general-purpose bombs, and when racks thin with depth charges lashed as makeshift bombs. The goal is not elegance. The goal is to force the enemy to turn again before range clocks settle. Logistics sits under every choice. Magazines hold the 5-inch ammunition to sustain rapid fire for hours. Torpedo stocks are deep enough that spreads can be fired on geometry rather than hoarded for certainty. Aviation fuel and spares keep deck cycles from stalling when a gust tears a tie-down or a tire pops. Repair ships and tenders are staged forward to turn scars into patched plates quickly. Replacement crews are in the pipeline, gunnery ratings and damage control ratings trained in depth. The system can afford risk because it can backfill loss. That arithmetic is not courage alone, it is policy. Doctrine has already learned the hard parts. Smoke first, helm violence to ruin the enemy's rate solution, torpedoes as formation weapons. 5-inch high explosive at superstructure height to blind, deafen and strip communications. After Samar, these rules stop being clever and become standard. The after-action reports from Taffy 3 write the language with no adornment. Smoke early and renew often. Charge to force helm decisions in capital ships before fire control stabilizes. Aim at directors, rangefinders and signal bridges. Keep the decks cycling even if the first passes do not score clean hits. A pass that compels a turn is success. Training notes catch up fast. Destroyer and destroyer escort schools stress bow-on approaches for torpedo release, combing salvos on egress and brevity on radios. Carrier escort planners build ordnance tables that acknowledge scarcity and still deliver effect. If armor-piercing bombs are thin, use general-purpose bombs for mobility kills. If bombs run short, throw depth charges from altitude sufficient to shake piping and jam rudders. Air is not a single hammer here. Air is a set of nudges that never stop. Institutional enablers make the ideas travel. Underway replenishment keeps fuel and ammunition moving to small decks close to the fight. Battle damage triage at sea, backed by forward bases and repair ships, turns a ship around before word spreads that she is gone. Personnel depth matters more than any single name. A blinded director can be swapped if the spares are in the locker and a trained hand knows the bolts. A gun crew can stay on a beat if the next loader knows the rhythm. The Navy has built that redundancy on purpose. The charge exposes the other side's limits. Fuel scarcity makes every high-speed turn expensive, which means every torpedo alarm comes with a penalty that crewmen feel in their gut. Training hours cut by shortage make coordinated evasive maneuvers harder to execute without breaking firing solutions. Optics-dependent gunnery suffers when smoke and rain erase splashes, and when a 5-inch burst rips a canvas hood from a director. Radar fire control is not common across the line. Flag nets and voice circuits fight weather splinters and shock. Doctrine had expected escorts to screen passively while big guns settled the issue. A playbook for smoke torpedo charges is not in the rack. Above the waterline, the decision chain sets the template for the rest of the theatre. 7th Fleet reports capture the morning as a proof of method and distribute it across other escort groups and screens. The emphasis is not on ship-to-ship trading, but on formation disruption that protects flight operations. Evaluation boards state plainly that a forced battleship turn is worth a deck cycle, and that a deck cycle yields multiple passes, which in aggregate reduce enemy speed and accuracy. The calculus is minutes bought over tonnage traded. That equation is teachable. Numbers translate into behavior. One blinded director wastes dozens of shells while a new picture is built. One torpedo spread that compels a 20-degree turn buys a launch and a recovery. One renewed smoke sector extends a factory rhythm on the carrier deck that never waits for perfect weather. The destroyers are instruments that force these moments. They are not trying to kill a battleship alone. They are trying to make a battleship choose survival and in choosing lose the carriers. Small procedures harden into checklists. Pre-planned smoke sectors rotate to keep a continuous wall on the bearing that matters. Torpedo windows align with launch and recovery cycles so that a forced turn coincides with aircraft rolling. 5-inch priority lists sit taped to plotting boards, directors first, bridges second, topside batteries third. Armor is work for aviators later, or submariners with patience. Fighters receive explicit tasking to make harassment passes, whose purpose is helm changes, not glamour hits. Every department has a role that touches the same lever. The tone of the record is cold. The reports name Evans and Kintberger and Hathaway and Copeland, but they make a larger point that does not depend on personalities. The system favored charges because it could repeat them. The system kept the carriers flying because it was built to convert a moment of courage into a habit. The charge is courage, the repeat is policy. After Samar, policy is what kept the carriers flying. The myth carried a simple shape: big guns, advance, escorts dissolve, carriers die in daylight. Off Samar, that shape bends until it breaks. The first rip is geometry. A destroyer's torpedo alarm yanks a Japanese cruiser out of line, then another alarm on a battleship forces a second turn to comb, wakes already drawn in the water. What had been a straight hammer begins to hinge at 2-3 points. Range clocks that were tightening now drift as bearings slide. A director, blinded by 5-inch high explosive, becomes dead weight until a spare optic is lashed into place, and by then the picture has changed again. Damage accumulates in the places that determine tempo rather than pride. Kumano's bow is opened, and her speed collapses, removing one gun line and adding drag to any attempt to reform. Chikuma, harried by small-deck aviators, takes hits that bleed away wayfinding and endurance before she is finished. Other cruisers wear fires that are not fatal by themselves but force men to leave guns, to move hoses, and to choose between powder and water in a compartment that will not take both. Battleships that once wrote their will across the sea now spend long minutes writing tight circles around torpedo wakes, because survival, of hull, of crew, of command, outweighs the urge to hold a gun track on a flat top glimpsed between sheets of rain. From the carrier's perspective, the proof is measured in launches, not kills. Every forced turn equals a deck cycle gained. Wildcats rake bridges and signal nests to make even a hitless pass meaningful by stretching the next correction. Avengers drop general-purpose bombs, and when needed depth charges used as clumsy but serviceable hammers against pumps, steering and lines. The object is to keep the enemy from settling. Settling is what kills carrier decks. Disruption is what keeps them flying. On Japanese bridges, the cadence of confident calculation thins into clipped acknowledgements that admit uncertainty. The order to adjust deflection gives way to an order to turn. The instruction to maintain ladder timing yields to a report that splashes are not visible and that the target has vanished into smoke. The helmsman's hands do not leave the wheel. The compass card refuses to steady as evasions stack. Under such motion, main battery time on the carriers shrinks to narrow, perishable windows that close whenever a destroyer's bow breaks through the veil and commands attention again. The screen repeats its cycle without flourish. Smoke generators renew the wall. A destroyer charges to knife range to force another set of helm decisions. 5-inch bursts climb a cruiser's face until a director hood folds or a rangefinder goes slack. Torpedoes leave at intervals, computed to coincide with launch and recovery windows on the decks behind. Nothing about this is theatrical. It is procedural, and it is relentless, and in that relentlessness, the old assumption dies, that small ships could only die usefully, while big ships decided. Losses on the American side are real and leave holes you can list by name. Gambier Bay goes down under cruiser fire. Johnston, Hoel and Samuel B. Roberts will not be counted again at muster. The myth does not break because the escorts prove invulnerable. It breaks because even as they are killed, they impose the behavior that matters, turns that pull great hulls away from the objective and erase minutes the carriers need to keep throwing metal into the morning. When the clock and the chart are the weapons, those minutes are victory transposed into time rather than into tonnage. The record will later write the conclusion in a tone as dry as a staff file. Destroyer attacks disorganized the advance. Torpedo menace compelled frequent alterations, of course. Fire control was repeatedly blinded. Ranging on escort carriers proved impracticable in prevailing conditions. Those phrases float without blood, but under them live the physical facts of wet hands on a wheel that will not stop moving and eyes that cannot find their own splashes through smoke. The center force withdraws northward with gunweight still aboard and cruisers wounded, having failed to lay sustained fire on the carrier hulls that were the purpose of the sortie. Behavior changes in the moment, and that change is the pivot. Japanese captains choose survival turns and station keeping over pursuit geometry. Their formations kink and never fully straighten before the next alarm. American escorts hold to their cycle. The next run is already plotted with pencil on wet plastic, while damage control clamps a steaming line, and men haul ammunition by hand across a deck that does not stop tilting. The carriers do not pause. Launches and recoveries stack, and each stack is built on forced decisions the enemy did not plan to make. The collapse is two-layered. On the bridges and in the directors, men learn that the steady ladder does not exist inside smoke and torpedo water against charging escorts. In the paperwork that follows, commands codify that lesson into method and move it across a fleet already designed to turn lessons into orders. The myth that big guns could simply walk through light screens to kill small carriers in daylight does not survive the morning. The ships remain, the guns remain, the armor remains, but the certainty is gone. Chart it on a map, and the inflection looks like a path that should have gone straight to the southeast, and instead wanders, halts, and turns back. Chart it in time, and it looks like a morning that should have been brief and decisive, and instead extends until the window closes. No one writes a grand conclusion on the bridge in that weather. They write helm orders, and range changes, and damage reports, and then an admiral writes the order to retire. The lesson moves outward within days in the form of after-action notes and revised checklists. Smoke early, charge to force the turn, aim at the eyes, keep the decks flying. After Samar, big guns still ruled distance, but not a morning where small ships made them turn. By late morning, the water behind the smoke wall is littered with rafts and oil streaks, but the flight decks are still turning into the wind. Taffy 3 holds. Lete's beachhead keeps its cover, Avengers still droning inland with bombs and radio calls to infantry who never see the battleships that missed their window. Gambier Bay is gone, her wake a memory under rain. Johnston Hoel and Samuel B. Roberts are missing from roll call. Street. Low is struck by a kamikaze and goes under at midday. White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Fanshawe Bay, Kitkun Bay and the others wear new scars and keep flying anyway. Northward, the center force drifts out of the morning. It had planned to own cruisers, wounded fire parties, exhausted helm orders, still echoing in heads that have not seen a steady compass card for hours. In the next days, the story hardens into orders. 7th Fleet pushes extracts across desks and wardrooms, smoke early charge to force turns, aim 5-inch at directors and bridges, keep decks cycling. Destroyer and destroyer escort classrooms rewrite torpedo windows to match carrier launch and recovery, the timing printed on boards where men can point to it with wet fingers. CVE air groups receive a line that sounds plain until you hear it in rain. If your load is light, make helm anyway. A pass that forces a turn is a hit against time. Replenishment groups nose in under the umbrella and top off magazines and avgas before the rhythm can falter. Repair ships lay out hoses and welders. Bent plates come off, new plates go on, antennae are restrung, and the talk in the mess is about the next cycle rather than the last hit. On the Japanese side, the ledger changes tone without theatrical sentences. Bridge teams who trusted pure gunnery in daylight now know what smoke, rain, and determined small hulls do to a range clock. After-action notes admit what the bones already learned. The torpedo menace compelled frequent alterations of course, and fire control was repeatedly blinded. Ranging on escort carriers proved impracticable in prevailing conditions. Surface commanders brief crews to avoid daylight penetrations against carrier screens without firm air parity. Fuel is counted tighter. Hull preservation becomes a priority even when the map invites a straight push. The oar in names loses its edge. A battleship still carries weight but not certainty. For Americans, the fear of big guns becomes a checklist. Uncertainty is traded for verbs: identify, acquire, fire, relocate. Smoke sectors are drawn before dawn and renewed by plan rather than panic. 5-inch priority cards are taped to plotting boards where a gloved knuckle can tap directors' bridges' topside guns in that order. CICs practice fusing radar pips and human eyes until the loop runs under noise. The charge is still courage, but the repeat is policy, and policy outlives any single ship or captain. Evidence piles up in quiet places. Deck logs show uninterrupted cycles stamped through the minutes when enemy formations kinked into evasions. Damage sketches from the cruiser force map, blinded directors and jammed steering before reversals, of course. Radio transcripts catch a rhythm target burning shift left protect the carriers. The pattern holds across rooms and hulls until it stops feeling like a story and reads like a procedure manual written in shrapnel. The cost sits beside the method. Names are read aloud and the room listens. No one pretends the morning was cheap. The argument is that it was bought at the price that kept the invasion's air over the beaches, and that the purchase contract is now standard. If a destroyer charge buys a deck cycle, and a deck cycle buys 3 passes that break speed and sight again, then the math is clear enough to teach. What if the center force had held straight course through the first torpedo spreads and eaten the risk? Do the escort carriers live through the next 10 minutes of main battery fire, or does the beachhead's air go thin enough that the day tilts the other way? What if a division of fast battleships had been on Sprague's horizon? Does the charge still become doctrine, or does it pass as a brave interlude remembered in citations rather than codified in schools? The comments will argue. The checklists will not. The thread we follow next stays with the same spine procedure, beating myth by geometry and timing. Night at Surigao Strait waits down channel, where old guns laid into a crossfire by men who trusted their plot more than their calibers make a battleship line turn into history.